Jonah House community started these faith and resistance gatherings, and the first ones were in the late 70s, and it was just a time, and we used to be able to go in the inside of the Pentagon. It was like a shopping mall. So we would have our vigils and stuff, actions inside the Pentagon. It was called the Concourse. And I had seen an action and people poured ashes, and I actually had this experience of knowing that this is truth and this is what I had to do with my life. So I was in my 20s, so I've had kind of a, kind of a direct path in resisting nuclear weapons, but also the normal stuff of having kids and taking care of kids, and then kind of weaving in. And then when the Iraq War started up, I started getting involved again with actions. So, I mean, I had been involved with the trains, and then I ended up being a single parent. So that was my priority. I was working and taking care of my kids. And then two of my kids were in high school and one was in college when the Iraq War started. And that's when I started getting more involved again. And it was still nuclear weapons as the primary focus, but all the other injustices that are related and can lead to nuclear war. So anyway, and that got me into SwiftPack, so the Plowshares. But I had been back east. I was part of the Atlantic Life community when the first discussion of the first Plowshares started. And at that time, I was more involved with issues around violence against women. And we had a lot of the Take Back the Night marches and things like that in the late 70s in Baltimore. I was in Baltimore. And then I moved to Hartford, Connecticut. And I was still involved with the nuclear things, but that was my main focus at the time. So, anyway, and then I ended up the Trident was always involved, kind of weaving in and out of my life. In that the first time I heard about Bob Aldridge resigning his job because of his conscience about the first strike capability of Trident, I was at a gathering in Washington, D.C., and we were demonstrating at the Pentagon and the Department of Energy at that time. And then I moved up and was part of a small community connected to the Atlantic Life community in Hartford, Connecticut. And we were leafleting at New London, Connecticut, where the Tridents were being built. And then I went back to DC in 1980. We had a year-long presence at the Pentagon. Jonah House sponsored it, and we took turns sponsoring or facilitating the gatherings. And I went to facilitate one of the gatherings and met the person who became my husband and father of my children. And he was from Montana, and I moved to Montana in the end of 1980. There were 200 missile silos in Montana at that time, and the Cold War was, going hot and heavy. And so our focus was the Maelstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls, Montana. And I was arrested on Easter Sunday. We used to have a demonstration there and cross the line, and that was the first time I was arrested in Montana. And then in November of 1982, I was arrested for climbing over a missile silo to prey on that missile would never be used. And at this time, the missiles were targeted towards Soviet Union countries. So I climbed over a fence. I had a small group of supporters, but we didn't take pictures or anything at that time. And I prayed, and I was 3 months pregnant with my daughter. I had planned this a long time before. And by the time it worked out that I could do it, I was also managing a homeless shelter in Missoula, Montana. By the time I could climb over the fence, I was 3 months pregnant, and that felt appropriate because the missile was targeted towards families. And I just felt really connected to that action. And I just went before the federal magistrate and pled nolo contendere because I was pregnant at the time. And I went to prison. I was given a 6-month sentence for trespass because I just climbed over the fence. And I had to serve 1 month of that. So I was in jail, and for a month. I was in Great Falls, Montana. There were 4 women in my cell, and 3 of us were pregnant. So it was like this camaraderie. But then anyway, through my incarceration, Jim Douglas knew about me and had written and said, do you know there's a train carrying nuclear warheads that goes through Missoula, Montana? And the railroad tracks were right behind our shelter where we had our overnight homeless shelter. And we had food and all kinds of things there. It's called the Poverello Center. So Jim told us about that, and we made a huge banner out of an old sheet that said, "Silence is betrayal, the nuclear train comes through this town." And we started vigiling, so people, the homeless people and people we knew connected with various peace groups in the university started vigiling on the tracks. And shortly afterward, the train, when it was coming through before our vigils, would stop overnight in Missoula. And it was actually stopped. And it was this whole thing of me being pregnant, being in a shelter, and this train that made me feel really violated and angry. So anyway, after we started vigiling, the trains rerouted itself, and it went, rather than going through Missoula, it went way into eastern Washington and up through the Indian reservation and over north Montana to avoid Missoula where all the hippies were. Well, whatever reason, but anyway, so after my daughter was born, I really wanted to be part of a community that was resisting nuclear weapons. And I was attracted to the community out here because of the Gandhian approach to looking at our violence within, and as well as addressing Trident. And when my daughter Christy was 3 months old, we came for a visit and ended up staying. And the original house was here, and we stayed about 6 weeks before we got a house in what was then the projects in Paulsbo. And we lived there and opened a real simple Catholic worker called Emmanuel House, and got involved with at that time, the community that included 3 couples with children, including Jim and Shelley and their son Thomas, and 3 lay women, and single women, and so they actually had been part of religious orders at that time. And then we started, the Tracks campaign was going strong, and my husband and I started out taking turns being arrested. He was arrested at a missile motor train that was coming to Bangor, and went to Kitsap County Jail for a short time. And then in 1985, February of 1985 was the white train that came, and 21 of us were arrested in front of that train, and we had a trial in Kitsap County. And were found not guilty for that action. And at that time I was pregnant with my second daughter, Alyssa. And so, so my whole life, my children's lives are all wrapped around the Trident resistance. Anyway, so in the back of my mind, I always had the idea of maybe being involved with the Plowshares action sometime. And it's one of those things that oh, the monks are here, the peace walkers. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Anyway, it was a love-hate relationship with me, because no way, it was kind of scary to do anything that was related to a Plowshares action. I had already climbed over a missile silo fence that had use of deadly force authorized, and in my mind the only deadly force was the missile itself, and I was not authorizing that. And so that was related to what I was doing here at Bangor. A group of us started meeting, discussing about the possibility of doing a Plowshares action somewhere in the country. My heart was right here with the Trident campaign, and we ended up selecting this, but it was definitely more of a consensus decision. And then we spent a year going through this discernment process of, you know, what does it mean? How do we do it? What's the message we want to say? And then our personal discernment, which was probably more critical, to be in the right framework to do something like this where you are risking your life. I mean, it's not a frivolous thing to go into an armed military base. And anyway, the five of us committed to doing this action, and on November 2nd, 2009, on All Souls Day, we cut through the fences and got to SwiftPack, where the nuclear weapons are stored. And I was telling someone earlier of, I don't regret any of that. It was the most deeply spiritual moment of my life to go to this horrible, horrible area. It looked like a J.R.R. Tolkien scene of, it was before dawn, and the trees were leafless in November. So you have these black sticks sticking in the ground, this eerie light that turned night into day at the storage weapons area. And it just cast an eerie light. And then we just together and very silently knew what we were going to do. We were going through the next fences. There were 2 more fences. Ann and Susan and I tied one of our banners to the outside of this fence. And then we went through the first fence. Nothing happened. We knew, at least in my mind, I knew something was going to happen soon because of these huge sensors in the ground. We got to the next fence, decided to cut through it, and it had this other tension wire through it, so we very carefully cut through that, and were careful that it didn't spring and hurt anyone. And went through that fence. Sister Ann Montgomery and I, we had decided ahead of time that we would go first and hold the banner that explained why we were there, and to be as peaceful as possible to go on to that area. Standing right next to the weapons storage, and in my mind I've always had a vivid image of this area because of the photos that were taken after the white train came once and was unloading in these areas. So the bunkers were there, and And then my background is I'm a registered nurse and a social worker, but my original work was in an emergency room in Baltimore, and then I worked in the trauma unit. So I worked a lot with horrible trauma and burns. And I've always had this vivid image of, you know, this is a bomb, this is what happened in Hiroshima, this is what could happen here, and that's unacceptable. And so to be on that spot and to be able to be totally at peace and prayerful was really meaningful to me. And several months later, when we had our trial, I was also working. I had quit my job and everything, so there was this opening in Tacoma at the Tacoma Catholic Worker, connected with the Tacoma Catholic Worker. And so I took an early retirement and became a residential manager for women coming out of prison. So before I went to prison, that's what I was doing. So anyway, ended up spending 6 months in prison. And as I told one of the prosecutors a couple weeks ago, I said it was better than on-the-job training for me, because even though I've worked with women who have been in prison and families connected with addictions and mental illness, I got to be there firsthand, and it's a whole different viewpoint, and I value that 6 months opportunity to also share in a different kind of women's community, and to bring that into my work and life today.